Story 1, The Haunted Pumpkin Patch. My name is Matt, and this is a story I've only ever told a few close friends. I'm not one for ghost stories or supernatural nonsense, but what happened that Halloween night still haunts me. It was supposed to be just another night of fun, but it turned into something that none of us could explain, something I've spent years trying to forget. I've come to terms with the fact that I probably never will. It all started with an innocent idea, a trip to an old pumpkin patch. It was the last Halloween before college, and my group of friends, Jake, Sarah, Emily, and I, wanted to do something different. We had done the usual parties, haunted houses, and corn mazes in the past, but this year, we wanted something new. That's when Jake heard about this abandoned pumpkin patch on the outskirts of town. "You guys heard of Hollow Creek?" Jake asked one day while we were sitting around his living room. None of us had, so he explained. Apparently, there was this farm just outside of town that had been left to rot after the farmer and his family mysteriously disappeared years ago. Locals said that every Halloween, the pumpkins would grow back on their own, but no one ever dared to go after dark. People claimed it was cursed, that anyone who went after nightfall would never come back the same. Naturally, we thought it was all bullshit. We were 18, too old to be scared of ghost stories. So we made a plan to head out to the farm that Halloween night. The drive out to Hollow Creek was long, about 45 minutes out of town. The farther we drove, the more isolated it felt. No streetlights, just the narrow beam of our headlights cutting through the darkness. Eventually, the road turned into a dirt path and we knew we were close. The house came into view first. An old Victorian-style farmhouse, leaning slightly to one side, covered in ivy and completely dark. "This place is straight out of a horror movie," Emily said, half joking, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. "Yeah, but we're not here for the house," Jake said, pointing toward the fields behind it. "The pumpkin patch is just beyond that hill." We parked near the house and grabbed some flashlights. Sarah hesitated as we started toward the field. "I don't know about this, guys. It feels wrong," she muttered. I'll admit I was getting a weird vibe too, but we laughed it off, reassuring her that we'd be fine. We crossed through the old, rusted gate that led into the patch, and that's when things started to feel off. The air was cooler here, and the silence was heavy, like the whole area was holding its breath. We could see the pumpkins scattered across the field, but there was something strange about them. Some of them were huge, much bigger than any pumpkin should be, and their surfaces were covered in dark, twisted vines. Jake was the first to point out the scarecrow. It was half buried in the ground, only its head and arms sticking out, its straw limbs twisted unnaturally. Its face wasn't painted or carved like most scarecrows. It was just a blank, weathered burlap sack. But when our flashlights hit it, I swear, it felt like it was watching us. "Weird," Jake muttered, kneeling down to inspect it. "Looks like it's been here for years." We all gathered around, curiosity getting the better of us. That's when Emily noticed something carved into the wood post sticking out of the ground. "What's that?" she asked, brushing some dirt away. We leaned closer, and that's when we saw it. Strange symbols etched into the wood. They looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, twisting and curling into shapes that made me feel dizzy just looking at them. "Okay, this is getting freaky," Sarah said, stepping back. Jake, always the brave one, shrugged. "Come on, it's just an old scarecrow. Someone probably thought it'd be funny to carve some spooky symbols." But I wasn't so sure. As we continued deeper into the pumpkin patch, things got weirder. We started hearing whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't take long to realize that the voices were coming from all around us. The pumpkins. It was like they were alive, whispering things we couldn't understand, voices swirling in the air, getting louder with every step. Sarah was the first to break. "I'm done, guys. I'm leaving." She turned and started walking back toward the gate. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to rise from the ground itself. We all froze, flashlights darting around, but there was nothing. Just the pumpkins, the scarecrow, and the cold wind. "Let's go," I said. "Now." We turned back toward the house, but the path we came in on, it was gone. The pumpkins had shifted, forming new rows and patterns, like the patch was rearranging itself. The gate was nowhere in sight. Jake, always the skeptic, insisted we must have just taken a wrong turn, but I could see the panic creeping into his face. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I thought I heard my name in one of them, and I wasn't the only one. Emily grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. It's calling my name." We started running. We didn't care where we were going anymore. We just needed to get out. But every direction we went led us deeper into the patch. The scarecrow somehow was always in sight, no matter which way we turned. That's when it happened. Jake stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight flickering. We turned back to see him staring at one of the pumpkins, but this one wasn't like the others. It was split open, and inside was something I'll never forget. A human hand, pale and rotting, sticking out from the flesh of the pumpkin. Jake stumbled back, his face ashen. What is this?" The ground began to tremble, and the scarecrow, now fully upright, seemed to be watching us. Its head tilted to one side as if curious, its blank face glowing faintly in the darkness. We didn't wait to find out what it wanted. We ran. I don't remember how we got out, but eventually we found ourselves back at the car, panting and terrified. Sarah was crying, Emily was shaking, and Jake just stood there staring blankly into the night. When we got back to town, none of us could speak. We didn't talk about what happened for a long time, but there was one thing I'll never forget. The next morning when we went back to look for Jake, he never showed up for school. We found his car still parked by the house. The pumpkin patch was gone, just an empty field of dirt. But the scarecrow? It was back, standing tall in the middle of the field, and carved into its chest were the same symbols we saw that night. And every Halloween since, I've heard the whispers, calling my name.
Story 2. The Silent Trick-or-Treaters. My name is Steve, and what I'm about to tell you is something that still gives me chills, even though it happened years ago. It's not one of those typical ghost stories you hear around Halloween. No haunted houses or eerie cemeteries. This happened in my quiet suburban neighborhood, where nothing ever seems out of the ordinary. That was until Halloween night, when Diane and I met the silent trick-or-treaters. Diane, my wife, and I have always loved Halloween. Our street, Cedar Lane, turns into a festive scene every October. All the houses are decorated with carved pumpkins, fake spider webs, and spooky decorations. The kids love coming to our place because we always go all out. Our yard becomes a mini haunted house, complete with fog machines and eerie music. It's tradition. That year, Halloween started off like any other. We handed out candy to a steady stream of kids dressed as superheroes, witches, and monsters. The weather was unusually warm for October, and the streets were packed with families. Everything felt normal, even fun, as we watched the neighborhood kids enjoy themselves. Around 9 p.m., the crowd started to thin out, and Diane and I figured it was winding down. We were just about to close the door and settle in for the night when we heard a knock. I opened the door expecting to see some late-night teenagers looking for candy, but instead, there stood 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. They were dressed in old, tattered costumes like something out of the 1950s. One boy wore a clown suit with oversized buttons. The girl had on a faded Victorian-style dress, and the other boy was dressed as a soldier, but his uniform was worn and dusty, as if it had been left in an attic for years. But what struck me most was their silence. They didn't say a word. No trick or treat, no smiles, nothing. They just stood there, staring at us with wide, unblinking eyes. Diane and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the weirdness of the situation. Happy Halloween, I said awkwardly, holding out the candy bowl. They didn't move, not an inch. Their eyes stayed fixed on us, cold and lifeless. Diane, trying to shake off the weird vibe, bent down and dropped a few pieces of candy into each of their bags. Still, no reaction. No thank you, no smiles, just that unsettling silence. After what felt like forever, they turned and walked away, but not like normal kids. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and they didn't speak to each other as they disappeared into the dark. I stood there at the door for a moment, feeling a creeping unease wash over me. Diane nudged me. That was weird, right? Kids today. I nodded, but something about the encounter felt wrong. The whole street was quiet now, and the air had grown colder. There wasn't another knock on the door that night, and eventually we turned off the lights and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to soft knocking. I checked the clock, 2 a.m. Confused, I got out of bed and went downstairs thinking maybe someone needed help. As I approached the front door, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I peered through the peephole and my stomach dropped. It was them. The 3 silent trick-or-treaters standing in the same spot, staring at the door. Their eyes seemed even more hollow now, their expressions completely blank. They stood motionless, their bags still hanging by their sides as if they had never left. Diane joined me at the door, groggy and confused. "Who's knocking at this hour?" she whispered. I opened the door just a crack, heart pounding. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The kids didn't even blink. My throat tightened as I noticed something strange. Their costumes were dirty, as if they'd been wandering for hours. And their eyes were wrong, too dark, too empty. Diane tugged at my arm, whispering, "Just close the door, Steve." I did. I slammed it shut, my pulse racing. We stood there for a minute, listening. The knocking had stopped. But when I checked the window, they were still there, just standing in our front yard, staring up at the house. "What are they doing?" Diane asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, "but something's not right." We sat there in the living room, too on edge to sleep. Every time I checked the window, they were still there, always watching. At one point, I swear I saw them move closer to the house, but when I blinked, they were in the same spot. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with us, and we drifted off to sleep in the living room. But I had nightmares. In my dream, the 3 kids were inside our house, standing at the foot of our bed, whispering something I couldn't understand. Their faces were twisted into grotesque smiles, and their eyes were completely black. The next morning, we woke up to daylight streaming through the windows. The kids were gone. Relief flooded through me, but when I opened the front door to step outside, I froze. Taped to the door was a note written in shaky, childlike handwriting. "We'll be back next year." I felt my heart skip a beat. Diane read it over my shoulder, her face going pale. What does that mean?" she stammered. I didn't know. We tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. And it wasn't just us. As I walked down the street that morning, I noticed that several other houses had the same note taped to their doors. Neighbors were standing outside, whispering to each other, confused and uneasy. That day, I talked to a few of them. Most had experienced the same thing. 3 silent kids, strange costumes, no words, just an unsettling presence. But here's the thing that really sent chills down my spine. One of our neighbors, Mrs. Hawthorne, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades, claimed she had seen them before. "They've been here before," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Years ago. And they come back. Every few Halloweens they show up. Different houses, but always the same children." I didn't want to believe her, but as Halloween approached the next year, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. We didn't decorate that year. No fog machines, no spooky music. We stayed inside, kept the lights off, hoping they'd leave us alone. But at 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. My stomach dropped as I opened it a crack, holding my breath. There they were, the same 3 kids, in the same tattered costumes, standing in silence. I slammed the door shut without a word. I don't know who or what they are, but every year they come back. The notes keep appearing, and each year there are more houses on our street that get visited. More people who are left wondering if next year will be the year they come for more than just candy.
Story 3, The Forgotten House Party. My name is Justin, and what happened one Halloween night still messes with my head. It wasn't supposed to be anything unusual. A house party with friends, drinks, and music. It was meant to be the highlight of our year before college started weighing us down. But what actually happened? Well, it's the kind of thing you'd want to forget. The problem is, none of us can. It all started with a group text. My buddy Sam sent it out to me, Ethan, Lily, and Claire. He'd found a house, way out in the hills, supposedly abandoned for years. According to him, it was perfect for a Halloween party. Isolated, big, and just a little creepy. Sam was always into the thrill of being in places he wasn't supposed to be. "Dude, this place is massive," Sam said when he convinced us to check it out. "It's old, but still in great shape. No one will bother us there." The plan was to head out to the house a few days before Halloween and scope it out. Sam gave us the address and we all piled into my car. It was an hour drive from town, getting farther away from anything familiar. The road started to wind, and the houses got fewer and farther between until, eventually, we turned onto a dirt path. The kind of path where you wonder if your GPS is lying to you. But then there it was, the house. It was huge, 3 stories, with old ivy climbing up the walls, and stone gargoyles perched on the roof like they were watching us. The windows were cracked and dusty, but the house itself still had a strange charm to it. It looked more like an old mansion than just some random forgotten house. It didn't look like a place that had been abandoned for long. "See? Told you this place was sick," Sam said, clearly proud of his find. We all got out of the car and walked up to the front door. It creaked open, like it was inviting us inside. Inside, the house was eerily intact. There were old paintings on the walls, furniture covered in white sheets, and chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, their crystals coated with years of dust. It felt like time had stopped in this place, like whoever had lived here just left. Lily wrinkled her nose. "This place is creepy. How do you even find a place like this, Sam?" "Luck," Sam grinned, heading deeper into the house, already planning out where we could set up the drinks and speakers. Ethan and Claire followed, more curious than concerned. I stayed behind with Lily for a second, just taking it all in. She looked uneasy, and honestly, I wasn't feeling too great about the place either. A few days later, Halloween arrived, and we were back at the house, setting up for the party. We had invited some friends from school, but the turnout wasn't huge, just around 15 people. Not a problem, though. It was enough for a good time. We decorated the place with lights, brought a few costumes, and by the time the sun set, the house was lit up with music, laughter, and a steady flow of drinks. At first, everything was normal. People were hanging out in the living room, playing beer pong in the dining room, and even sneaking up to the second floor to explore the bedrooms. The place felt less eerie now, more like it was coming alive again. But then things started to get strange. It was about 11 p.m. when Ethan, who had been sitting with a few others in the living room, came up to me. He had this weird look on his face, like he wasn't sure if he was joking or actually freaked out. "Hey man, have you noticed anything weird?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "Weird how? Like, the people here. There's more of them." I laughed, thinking he was messing with me. "Well, that's what happens when people show up late to a party. No, I mean, there's more people here than we invited." He pointed to the living room. "I don't recognize half of those people." I looked where he was pointing. Sure enough, there were some faces I didn't recognize. I figured maybe they were friends of friends who had shown up without telling us. It wasn't a big deal, but the look on Ethan's face made me uneasy. "I'll check with Sam," I said, and I went to find him. Sam was upstairs with Claire, laughing and messing around with some old records they found. When I told him about the extra people, he shrugged it off. "It's a party, man. People are bound to crash." He had a point, but something about it didn't sit right with me. As I looked around, I noticed something odd. A few of the unfamiliar faces weren't interacting with anyone. They were just standing there, watching, not talking, not drinking, not dancing, just watching. I nudged Sam and gestured toward them. "You see that?" He glanced over, his smile faltering for just a second. "Yeah. Okay, that's weird." The atmosphere in the house started to shift. The music didn't seem as loud anymore. The lights felt dimmer. It was like the air itself had become heavy, oppressive. I walked over to one of the strangers, a guy dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it belonged in the 1920s. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes seemed wrong. They were too dark, too deep, like there was nothing behind them. "Hey man, you good?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. I backed away, my heart pounding. I went to find Lily, who had been hanging out near the kitchen. When I found her, she looked as freaked out as I felt. "Justin, there's something wrong with this place," she whispered. "I keep seeing people I don't recognize, and they're just standing there." That's when we all started noticing it. The party wasn't moving anymore. The strangers, who seemed to outnumber us now, were all just standing, silently watching us. No one else had come into the house, and yet the place felt packed. My stomach twisted as I realized that none of these new people had come in with cars, costumes, or even the usual chatter that guests bring. Then, the lights flickered, and when they came back on, half of the partygoers were gone. The music was still playing, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the house. Ethan, Sam, Lily, Claire, and I huddled together. "What the hell is going on?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but we need to get out of here." We rushed toward the front door, but when we got there, it wouldn't open. Sam, usually the bravest of the group, tried to kick it down, but the door didn't budge. The air around us seemed thicker now, harder to breathe. And then, we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the staircase. We turned to see one of the strangers, a woman in a long, tattered dress, walking down the stairs, her head tilted slightly, eyes locked on us. Behind her, more of the silent figures began to follow, emerging from the shadows like they had always been there. That's when the lights went out, and everything went silent. When I woke up, it was daylight. The house was empty. No party, no people. Just me, Sam, Lily, Claire, and Ethan, sitting in the middle of the floor, confused and shaken. We left that house and never went back. To this day, we don't talk about what happened. It's like the whole night has been forgotten by everyone, except us. But every Halloween, I still feel it. That sense of being watched, of strangers standing just beyond the light. And I wonder if one day they'll come back for us.